This episode could be triggering for sensitive listeners and contains mature content. It may not be suitable to all listeners. Should you need any emotional assistance, please see the show notes for telephone numbers that you can call. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are my own and do not reflect the official policy or position of the podcast. Any content provided by contributors, such as the host, guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors, are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. Dictionary.cambridge.org says, if you have a change of heart, you change your opinion or the way you feel about something. If you have been extremely hateful for decades, and in that time taught others to be equally as hateful, what will happen if you suddenly have a change of heart? Will this flock, who have been so devoted to your teachings, listen, or will they reject you? Just like you taught them to reject those who did not have the same opinion as you. This is Decoding Cults, and I'm your host, Palsy. This episode is about the Westboro Baptist Church, Part 3. Last week, we looked at the rest of Fred's teachings and continued with the church's history. We then dove into how this church ended up in the mainstream media. This week, we continue with the history of the Westboro Baptist Church and end the series with where they are now. If you haven't listened to the first two parts of this series on Westboro, I suggest that you pause here and listen to those so that this episode makes more sense. I'm going to insert a trigger warning right here at the start, as there will be homosexual slurs within this episode. Once again, these are not my words, and I do not condone the use of them at all. Please take care. If this is in any way triggering or deeply offensive, rather skip over this episode. In the year 2000, a former philosophy student and documentary filmmaker from Florida named Steve Drain decided to go to Topeka for the summer with the aim of making a film on how ridiculous the Westboro Baptist Church's beliefs were. This film was called Hate Mongers. In this documentary, Fred and various members of his family explain why they feel the way they do. It feels very much like a tribute to the group rather than the mockumentary that it was supposed to be at the start of the project. In this documentary, Fred states that the media is corrupt and are part of the so-called fag agenda. He also paints the entertainment industry under this same brush. Well, Steve Drain went back to Florida and thought about all the things that he had learned from the group. Then he decided to pack up his wife and children and move to Topeka to join the church. Lauren Drain, who is Steve's eldest daughter, was 14 years old at the time, and stated in an interview that it was a huge culture shock for her when they joined the community. She had gone from wearing makeup, hanging out with friends, and starting to date boys, normal teenage stuff, to not being allowed to speak to other teenagers that were not in her community, having to completely change her wardrobe, not even being allowed to dye or cut her hair. I can only imagine that this was a very hard transition for her. Up to this point, the Phelpses were still attacking the LGBTQIA+ community, other Christian denominations, other religions, and what Fred deemed to be sinful places like strip clubs. Fred was teaching his congregation that what they were doing was not hateful, but was in fact how they were loving their neighbor. that they were delivering a very important message to mankind. Then, something would happen which would change not only the world, but also the direction of Fred's hate speech. Most people can recall exactly where they were on 11 September 2001 when the news broke that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center. For the rest of the world, it was a day of sadness, terror, and uncertainty. For Fred, however, it was a day to rejoice. He thanked God for the death of sodomite Americans. He claimed that God had sent the planes into the Twin Towers, casting down the symbols of American strength and vitality in punishment of her great sins: homosexuality, adultery, fornication, idolatry, and rebellion. Fred imposed a new rule that the followers were no longer allowed to celebrate Independence Day, which is the 4th of July each year. Not long after these attacks, the West waged war on the Taliban by bombing targeted al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. While people in America were mourning the death of soldiers, Fred was once again rejoicing in their death. By the late 1990s, early 2000s, Fred was already in his 70s and didn't have the stamina that he used to. One of his daughters, Shirley Phelps Roper, who was the 5th of his 13 children, took over the church's administrative duties from Fred so that he could focus on his sermons. Shirley was groomed by Fred to take over and would arrange the pickets, travel, and all other administrative duties, basically like becoming the second in command for the church. Her husband, Brent Roper, who had joined the church as a teenager, was very supportive of her and helped with the duties. In her book Unfollow, Megan Phelps Roper writes how her parents were a great team. In 2002, a Pentecostal Christian pastor was prosecuted for hate speech towards homosexuals in Sweden. This, of course, led the Westboro group to go and protest at any place within their town who sold any Swedish products, and they went to the Swedish embassy in Washington, D.C. The group even celebrated when the tsunami hit Thailand in 2004. They started making signs saying, "Thank God for Katrina," after the hurricane caused devastating destruction in parts of the U.S. They claimed that the hurricane was an outpouring of God's wrath. By 2005, the group started picketing at funerals of fallen soldiers. Fred would teach his followers that the deaths of these soldiers was God punishing the United States because of its tolerance of homosexuality, particularly in the military. One of the members in the group would monitor the death notices on a website for the Department of Defense. Another person would then be given a name where they would then search for information on the soldier and look for their funeral announcements. The group would then see what the trip would cost, if it was far away from town or out of state, and who would be available to go to the protest and pitch up at the funeral. They would then have signs saying that people should stop worshipping the dead and chant, "They turned America over to the fags, they're coming home in body bags." Ugh, it makes me sick just saying that. In an interview with Steve Drain, he stated that he does not feel guilty protesting while parents are mourning. He stated, "What they should be grieving about instead of the model and sensibilities that they're clutching to, what they should be grieving about is that they raise their sons to hell. They raise their sons for the devil. They raise their son or their daughter for the devil. Any time these people start lamenting and crying and all of that kind of stuff, what they really should be grieving about is the fact that they didn't do their duties to their sons and their daughters." He also often said, "Dying time is truth time," whatever that means. This to me sounds like a lot of thought-stopping cliches that Fred probably used on the group numerous times when they would ask about the protests. Well, that's my opinion on it. Those in the group who were able would travel all over the country and picket at these funerals. It was reported that their travel expenses would be around $200,000 per year. That's an insane amount of money. Then, on 3 March 2006, a soldier named Matthew Snyder, who was serving a tour in Iraq, was sadly killed in a non-combat related vehicle accident. His funeral was to be held on 10 March 2006, and once again the Phelpses and others from the congregation jumped into action. Fred, 2 of his daughters, and 4 of his grandchildren were able to go. Again, they showed up with signs saying things like, "God hates the USA," "Don't pray for the USA," and "Thank God for dead soldiers." Matthew's father, Albert, had seen the tops of the picket signs during the funeral, as the picketers were not allowed near the funeral. This was in adherence to the laws that I discussed in part 2 of the series. Later that day, he saw a news story which had covered the picketing and showed what exactly was on the posters. This led to Snyder suing the Westboro Baptist Church, Fred Phelps, and his daughters for defamation, publicity given to private life, intentional infliction of emotional distress, intrusion upon seclusion, and civil conspiracy. When Fred got word that the charges were being brought against him and the church, he asked his congregation to pray for the death of Arthur and those who were helping him. They prayed hard that God would get rid of them before the lawsuit would be filed. Obviously, this prayer went unanswered. The Snyder family's lawyer used tort law to argue the case. According to law.cornell.edu, a tort is an act or omission that gives rise to an injury or harm to another and amounts to a civil wrong for which courts impose liability. In the context of torts, injury describes the invasion of any legal right, whereas harm describes a loss or detriment in fact that the individual suffers. A federal district court granted the defamation and publicity given to private life charges. The Snyders were awarded a total of $10.9 million in damages, but this was later reduced down to $5 million, which is still a pretty decent amount. The Phelps family appealed and argued this all the way up to the Supreme Court, where, in 2011, it was found that because the family had abided by the picketing laws and other factors, that they were protected under the freedom of speech laws, under the First Amendment, and the original findings were overturned. For those of us who live outside of the U.S., the First Amendment is: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. In 2007, Lauren Drain, the eldest daughter of Steve Drain, was kicked out of the group. She had met a boy online and was trying to get him to join the group so that they could be together. When it was found that she had not only been in communication with a boy, but had also used her parents' credit card to book a flight for them to meet, she was sent to one of those meetings where she was excommunicated. From that point forward, she was not allowed any contact with any of her family who remained in the group. That same year, British documentarian Louis Theroux spent some time with the family and made a documentary called The Most Hated Family in America. Unlike Steve Drain, Louis was not persuaded by the group's beliefs. At one point, while Louis was interviewing Steve, he asked about Lauren. Steve replied, "My life isn't about pleasing myself. My life isn't about pleasing my children. My life is about pleasing my Lord." Louis also accompanied the group on some of their protests. At times, he would have conversations with Shirley. Shirley, if you remember, was the daughter that Fred was basically grooming to take over, and she had taken over most of the administrative duties in the church. Along with the various conversations that Louis and Shirley had, two things she said stood out to me. One was, "You think our job is to win souls for Christ? All we do by getting in their face and putting these signs in front of them in these plain words is make what was already in their hearts come out of their mouth." The other thing she said, "We are the evil angels, not because we are evil, but because we are bringing to you the message of the evil that God has determined upon you." Now I know that they may seem like random comments, but to me it's like she's explaining why she believes so fiercely and possibly justifies what they're doing to her. It seems like Louis had a very hard time pinning down an interview with Fred himself. And when he finally did get to speak to him, Fred was very dismissive, and in my opinion, he never really gave a straight answer to any of the questions that were asked of him. The crew also had the opportunity to film one of the Sunday sermons. Fred preached a lot about gay sin, American sin, and something about people eating babies. It was bizarre. I did find in a later interview from a former member who mentioned by this time that Fred was showing signs of dementia, although this was never diagnosed, just speculated, and the group was doing their best to keep him away from the documentary crew. Louis Theroux did go on to visit the Westboro Baptist Church 2 more times and made 2 more documentaries. I just couldn't access them. There were also many other documentarians and international media companies who reached out to the group, and Vice also spent some time with them. None of the documentarians or news crews were converted by the group, however. The church welcomed anyone who requested to interview them or spend time with them, because to them, any way of spreading the message or having their picket signs shown on television or the internet was a good thing. When Fred was interviewed by 60 Minutes Australia, one of the questions that was asked of him by Liz Hayes was why hate was the overriding feeling in all of the messaging, and that God is in fact not hate but love. This to me was a great question, because I'd been wondering where all of the hate had been coming from myself. Fred answered, "You can't believe the Bible or read the Bible without knowing that God Almighty mentions His hatred, His wrath, His indignation at the sins of mankind more than He talks about His love. So, if you're a Bible preacher, you're preaching hate." Yeah, that didn't really help me understand his hate at all. It was also around 2007 when the church started to make videos explaining their signs to people, creating parody music videos changing the lyrics from popular songs to their messaging. All of these videos can be found on their website. It makes me very sad to see the very young children taking part so willingly in these very, very hateful videos. I don't think some of them are even old enough to comprehend what exactly they're saying. In 2009, a play with the name of The Laramie Project was set to open in the UK. This play, written by Moses Kaufman, was written in the year 2000 and was based on the murder of Matthew Shepard. This is the young man that we discussed in part 2 of our series. The Westboro Baptist group had picketed where this play was being performed all over the US, but now it was going overseas. and it seems like the Westboro Baptist congregation wanted to spread their wings as well. When the authorities in England got wind of the fact that they wanted to travel there, the members of the church were banned by the UK from coming to their country to protest the play. In 2011, an indie horror film by the name of Red State was released. According to imdb.com, set in Middle America, a group of teens receive an online invitation for sex, though they soon encounter fundamentalists with a much more sinister agenda. I watched the movie, and to me this film is a combination of Westboro and the Branch Davidians. If you watched it, or are going to watch it, let me know if you agree, but I digress. When the film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and it was reported that it had been inspired by Westboro, obviously the congregation had to go and protest the film. Kevin Smith, who was the director of the film, had started a Twitter. Yes, I know it's called X now, but back then it was still Twitter. Anyway, he had started a #SaveMegan campaign, because by this time, Megan Phelps Roper, daughter of Shirley, had been advocating for the group on social media and on Twitter. When the Westboro picketers showed up at the premiere, Steve had a picketing sign of his own. It read, "God hates Phelps, except Megan. God thinks Megan's hot." It was also during this time that things were changing within the church. If you recall from earlier, Fred was allegedly not really in his right mind anymore, and he had groomed Shirley to take over a lot of his responsibilities. Well, it seems like a few of the male members in the congregation were not super happy about being led by a woman. Shirley's eldest son, Sam, and Steve Drain sent an email to Shirley basically accusing her of being overzealous in her nature and that she was unmerciful in the way that she treated her fellow congregants. Now, Shirley was no pushover. It's clear to see from her various interviews. But if you think about her role model, i.e., her father Fred, it's not surprising that she is the way she is. Well, at least in my opinion. Shirley sent out apology emails to each and every one of the members of the church, but the new Council of Elders, as they called themselves, had made up their minds. The Council of Elders comprised of all of the older married men in the congregation. Shirley was stripped of all her duties, including organizing pickets, planning the monthly events, among many others, and was not even allowed to give any further interviews to anyone in the media. If Shirley in any way disobeyed this new order, all of her children over the age of 18 would be made to move out of her house. Not live by themselves, but go and live with other families within the church. Remember, any unmarried person had to keep living with their parents until they were married. She would also be shamed and ostracized by the rest of the congregation. Brent Roper, who was part of the Council of Elders, was told to get his house in order. In other words, get his wife Shirley to fall in line. The one person who did stand up for Shirley was Fred, but by this time, his vote didn't really count anymore, according to these new elders. The new leaders started to make changes, and no, not for the better. These changes would come through on an ad hoc basis, and it seemed to have happened because they decided that they didn't like something someone did or said, and then they'd make up a new rule about it. First and foremost, all of the women would now be 100% subservient to their husbands. No surprises there. If any one of the female members did not have a husband or father, an elder would be appointed to them. Before, if anyone had any questions or concerns, they could share it with anyone in the congregation. Now, the female members had to go to their direct elder. One thing that Fred did not do was lie about what they were doing and where they were going. The new council, however, didn't have any qualms regarding this and would make those people who were responsible for social media and websites for the church lie about activities and pretend that they were doing things which they were not. And, if you can believe it, the elders imposed even more strict modesty rules. The females within the group had to cover even more of their bodies. Examples of this were high-necked blouses and pants or skirts that had to be below the knee, because the knees are so seductive. They were also not allowed to wear any sandals at Sunday services, but had to have their feet completely covered. This is another rule that I just don't understand. How are toes offensive to God? He made them. Just as Fred had made all of his children study law, the next generation were now limited as well. If they wanted to pursue any other field besides law, they were basically limited to nursing or computers. Other than that, some rules would differ from house to house. So I guess depending on how strict or lenient your dad/husband/elder is, that's how strictly you followed the rules. If anyone wanted to go anywhere or do anything, anyone besides the elders that is, they had to say where they were going and how long they would be out. This needed to be pre-approved and then double-checked before you could go. Now, for children, I get it. But for adults, who you're still forced to live at home, it's just bizarre. Imagine having to get pre-approval if you quickly need to run to the shops to get milk or something. What is surprising is that during this time, the church actually gained new members from not only within the US, but even from the UK. I guess there are still people out there that share these types of beliefs and are drawn to groups who openly state them. Megan writes in her book Unfollow about a couple who had newly joined. Among some of the things that had happened to them, the one that I found most interesting was that the group didn't speak to the wife because she had not yet been baptized. What stood out to me about this was the fact that she had no idea why she was being ostracized. Surely her husband, would have had that conversation with her, given that he is her elder. Apparently, because she had been with the group for 6 months and had not yet requested to be baptized, the elders decided that she needed to be isolated from the rest of the church as they deemed her to be a negative influence. I just want to take a moment to talk about the circumstances which led Megan Phelps Roper to leave the group in 2012. As I mentioned before, Megan did most of the group's social media engagement on Twitter at the time. Yes, there were those people who were hateful and very in your face about the group being a cult, but those who spoke gently to her and asked non-judgmental questions were the ones who really made her think about her beliefs and really question the messages that they were spreading. Gently planting these seeds helped to slowly open her eyes and would finally result in her leaving the group. The reason why I found this so powerful is that across many of the groups which I have researched, a lot of those who have left had a similar message. Those people who had gone up to them and aggressively told them how wrong they were at the time or that they were in a cult would ultimately push them further into the group. It would confirm the group's bias regarding the outside world. However, in cases where outsiders or even loved ones who did not belong to the group would come from a place of love, asking non-judgmental questions, or merely stating that if they ever need anything, that family member or friend was there for them. This little bit of kindness would plant a seed which would lead them to eventually come out. Janja Lalich, a cult expert who herself had been in one, describes the process best for me. the follower will find something small that they don't agree with, or feel is wrong, but will place this item on a shelf and carry on with the group and its teachings. Then, something else will happen which the follower will add to the shelf, and so on, until one day the follower will try to put that last thing on the shelf and the shelf breaks. And that is when the follower realizes that they need to leave. Something that was pretty cool about Megan's specific story was that this person, who helped her question her beliefs in a gentle and kind manner, happened to be a gay Jewish man. In 2012, a man by the name of Aaron Jackson bought the house across the road from the church for $81,000, which is around 325,000 rand. Aaron was scrolling Google Earth to look at the Westboro Baptist Church when he found that the house was for sale. What made this purchase significant was that Aaron is an activist and the founder of the non-profit organization called Planting Peace. On plantingpeace.org's About page, it states, Planting Peace is a global non-profit organization founded for the purpose of spreading peace in a hurting world. Our projects focus on a range of humanitarian and environmental initiatives, including our multinational deworming campaign, a network of orphanages and safe havens in developing countries, LGBTQ rights advocacy, Equality House and Transgender House, and rainforest conservation efforts in the Amazon. Then, in March 2013, Aaron hired a military veteran to paint the house in the colors of the Pride flag. He named this house Equality House. On the plantingpeace.org website it states, The Equality House is a symbol of compassion, peace, and positive change. The house, which is painted in the colors of the Pride flag, serves as the resource center for all Planting Peace human rights initiatives and stands as a visual reminder of our commitment as global citizens to equality for all. Needless to say, the members of the Westboro Baptist Church were not happy about this at all. At one point, Equality House was painted in the colors of the transgender flag, but the foundation purchased another house next door to Equality House and painted that house in the transgender colors. They then repainted Equality House back into the original Pride colors. The website says about this second property, the Mott House is a symbol of visibility, love, and support for the transgender community. It is part of the Equality House property and stands directly across from the Westboro Baptist Church. The house was painted in the colors of the transgender flag in June 2016 and was renamed Mott House in March 2019 to honor Kansas's greatest transgender activist, the late Stephanie Mott. It was also during 2013 where Margie had become seriously ill and ended up in intensive care. It's speculated that Fred, who was so extremely afraid of losing his wife, finally found some empathy with those regarding losing someone you love, and he had a change of heart. My opinion on this is that the thought of losing Margie, of having to say goodbye to her, finally made him see just how hurtful his protests were, especially at funerals. Fred then started to come out in support of things which he had previously so viciously opposed, like Equality House, and asking that the church members start treating one another with more kindness. The new leadership, or as they called themselves, Council of Elders, would have none of it, and decided to excommunicate Fred from the church. He went outside on his day of excommunication and basically said that he was wrong and that the people of Equality House were actually good people. Once excommunicated, Fred was moved to a care home at Midland Hospice House in Topeka. Most of the members of the church cut off all communication with him. Only a few were kept up to date with his medical status. When the media got wind of this, some reached out to the church to find out about Fred's status within the church, to which they simply were told membership issues are private and that they don't discuss internal church dealings with anyone. To me, this is rich, coming from people who love to scream hatred from the top of their lungs. One of Fred's daughters, Margie, stated that should Fred pass on, it would be pointless to speculate about his funeral arrangements because the Westboro Baptist Church does not believe in funerals or memorials because, quote, "We don't worship the dead in this church, so there'd be no public memorial or funeral to picket if any member died," end quote. Then, on 19 March 2014, at the age of 84, Fred Phelps passed away. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The church, however, continued with their hateful teachings, as nothing Fred did towards the end could help stop the machine he created in the first place. Those of his children and grandchildren who were left in the group carried on the protesting, spreading hate on their websites, and the elders continued preaching his teachings in Sunday services, with their own spin, obviously. I did find out that during the pandemic, the congregation was made to have smaller services at their homes. And it was during this time where Steve Drain realized that there was indeed a loving God, and he and his wife decided to leave the church, or as some reported, he was excommunicated from the church. Regardless of this, they have made contact with their daughter Lauren, and I think the family is beginning to heal. I know that Steve Drain is not exactly a hero in the story, but I do hope that he finds forgiveness both from the people who he has hurt and from within, and that he goes on to do better. Most of the people who have left or who have been excommunicated from the church have gone on to have good lives, and I know that healing from a life of abuse is an ongoing thing, but I hope that they are happy where they are. Despite this, the other members who are still fully invested in the church, and they continue to picket to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button and rate and review me. It will go a long way in improving the podcast and helping others find it. Please invite your family and friends to listen as well. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe and like the video. You can leave a comment too. You can find us on Facebook, and you can email me at decodingcults@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. If there are any topics around the workings of cults which you would like further explanation on, or if there is a cult that you would like to hear about, email me or post it in the Facebook group. Remember to go and check out bydesigncraftssa and ENDEAVOUR AV and tell them that I sent you. The amazing logo art was created by the tattoo artist Jock Jacobs. Thank you so much for listening.